Welcome back, everyone. Now, this afternoon we've got Geoffrey Huntley with what is clearly quite a topical subject, considering how full the room is. Now, Geoff's a software engineer who lives a minimalist lifestyle in a van that's slowly working its way around Australia. Now, today Geoffrey's going to talk about COVIDSafe, which is the Australian government's phone app that was designed to help with the pandemic. He's going to cover the technical reasons that the app failed to help and the security problems that it caused. Please welcome Geoffrey.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming here today. My acknowledgements is everyone here in attendance, original owners of the land, and also to LinuxConf Australia for actually making it possible for me to be in attendance. Throughout the talk, there's going to be a whole bunch of QR codes. There were so many things that went wrong with this application, and as I go through it, I would encourage you to actually have a look at the things that are cited. So first, this is kind of personal, right? If you remember what it was like back in 2022, what it was like back in 2020, this is my story. I was coming out of a long relationship and I just figured out it wasn't working. So it was also the start of the pandemic. That's another reason why it's to me, it was a huge point. So early February, I was camping with a whole bunch of hippies down in Tasmania. And if you ever wanted to learn about the ethos of open source, I encourage you, go back to the origins, understand the gift-based economy. This was really cool. So here I was camping, early 2000, and in January, and word was starting getting out that over in Babylon, the world was changing. Love was free, everyone was hugging, and everything was, there was no social distancing. It was strange. Love and hugs were free and plentiful everywhere. And every day I would go out, check in with my parents, let them know that I'm safe. And the call was made, it's getting a little bit hectic. So got on a plane from Scottsdale. Scottsdale has more than potatoes, by the way. And that's what it was like back in January. January, society was starting to fall apart. All the flights were being cancelled, there were signs everywhere that the cafes are shut down, social distancing. And society kind of entered into a point where time had no meaning. If you remember back then when the pandemic was first rolling through, everyone was just kind of sitting at home and time was bleeding into each other. Myself, I started building a van with my father, and that was quite great. But there was a problem. I'd recently separated, and my kids were in New South Wales. I'm in Queensland. This is why it's personal. So the borders were shut, and I was separated by two governments who just really couldn't get their act into gear at all. I went into this in my blog post and how much this personally affected me. Everyone has their story, but it was 13 weeks since I last saw my children because of these lockdowns. I missed both of their birthdays. I missed a school holiday period. It was really personal. And I was separated by two governments. I never really thought much about state and federal until COVID. COVID really showed the differences in how the Australian government is constructed. And every time I went across that border, it was $5,000. Every time I entered back into Queensland, so if I was to venture down quickly to see my children, that's $5,000 and 14 days hotel isolation. It was pretty grim times. Everyone has their story. This is mine. So the government launched this COVIDSafe application. I'm sitting at home and I'm faced with that. I want to see my kids. So they launched this application with grand affair. It was essentially the idea that a mobile technology could fix all our problems. That some application could open back up society. And, sitting there, nothing else to do, I jumped straight at it, right? I just want to get back and see my kids. And the government spent $21 million on this application, by the way. $21 million. Only a fraction was done on the software development, and it's not even worth mentioning how much was spent on the security assessment. That was all spent on advertising and marketing. Ludicrous. So the application itself was based upon the Singapore application. Now, the Australian government publicly said many times that the Australian application was based off the Singapore application, Bluetrace, and it would fix all the problems that Bluetrace had. And we're like, how's that possible? Like, because the problems that Singapore is having is like, it's a userland application. If it goes into the background, it doesn't work. That's how the application lifecycle works on iPhone. How could they fix that? And it was so strange. So the Australian government got a drop of source code from the Singapore government. And many weeks went by, and the Singapore government is updating its source code. They're fixing problems in the source code. And it turns out what had actually happened in the procurement, the Australian government had been given like essentially a tarball, and it had just been emailed around various agencies. Meanwhile, the Singapore government is releasing their stuff open source, and it's possible to contact and work with the engineers, and we're working off an old tarball. And we actually started looking at this source code. I'll get into that. And there were fixes in the Singapore source code that we just didn't have. So some of these claims just didn't make sense. And to make matters worse, we started to get like corporate entities pushing, have you installed the application? We had Foxtel saying you should install the application. We had fast food stores sending push notifications from the Macca's app saying, have you installed the app? Install the app. We want to get back into business. And even though it was a complete breach of legislation, we started to get like real estate agents saying you must have the application installed to be able to do a property inspection. So strange. The legislation specifically said you cannot require someone to install the application. Yet, we started entering into that territory. And if you're wondering how we got to this place, I think one of the first things we can start with was this application was launched with no technologists, right? It was a medical tool. Like, with all due respect to people in health, they had a need. They've gone to the market, and the market is the Digital Transformation Agency, and saying, we need an app built. And they did this big launch, and the launch there was just they're talking about the health benefits. But there was no one there that was actually technical at all. And that's wrong. Because what happened was we got some absolute numpties step up. In the absence of a technologist being provided at these press conferences who could explain how it worked, we got people who should have known better. They just signed a petition without even looking at how the application worked. Like, sure, at this time the source code wasn't available, but like, you can decompile an application, you can see how it worked. People started blindly advocating to install the application without any technical due diligence. We had people who just outright, when we decompiled the application, just blocked us. Like, we're explaining how it worked and just absolute numpties. And meanwhile, we had ministers talking about this application, and they're putting all their blame on Apple and Google. Now, COVIDSafe worked as a userland application. On mobile phones, particularly iPhone, what happens is a userland application, when it goes into the background, terminates after 10 minutes. It's actually worse than that. When it terminates, it takes a screenshot of the application. So what happened was the end user, the general public, where they actually thought the application was running. It was just a screenshot. So all this blame was being put onto Apple and Google. Meanwhile, they weren't using the devices as they're intended. Like, the life cycle was wrong. So, with a little bit of coaxing from Paul Fenwick, he was saying, like, there's a few people, they're talking about the application, and I'm like, hey, I'm going to start pulling it apart. decompile the application. And with reckless abandon, I compiled the application and decompiled the application and dumped it on GitHub. Like licensing, whatever, just dumped it there. Because source code is truth, right? We've got all these people talking about this application. We've got these companies saying, download the app before you can come into the workforce and what else have you. And so I decompiled the application and put together a report of the findings. And we held our own press conference, right? We held our own press conference. We explained how the application worked, and we started talking primary from fact. Now, this is something anyone here in this room or anyone watching this talk can do, right? If you ever see such circumstances, a lack of technical expertise, like if you know something, you should say something, because there's a good chance of what you know someone else might not know. And the absence of that knowledge, you get numpties, right? Absolute numpties. So, would you believe in the year 2000, we launched a national product to all the consumers of Australia, and there was no monitoring on social media. None. Like, we've got this thing, you must download and install the application, but there's no one monitoring social media. So it was myself and a bunch of other people, we started collecting some of the problems that people were having. And sure, Twitter is a little subsection, but it was really weird times. Like, for example, you couldn't install the application if you were traveling from the UK. Like if the app wasn't available into the international app store, it was only available in the Australian app store. Strange, okay, that's simple, just switch your app location, but you can't. You would have to cancel all your subscriptions with that account to be able to switch. And we just started collecting these faults, right? We started just collecting these faults. And the application itself, like there was sections on launch that actually, if you tapped in the wrong area, it actually said, you have COVID. It was literally a button that said, you have COVID. And on launch, we started communicating publicly and collating, working with the press, because there was no real way to engage with government agencies. And we said, look, this is going to cause hysteria. And what do you know? A week later, 9 News, some person in Frankston here in Melbourne went into complete lockdown because she thought that the app had diagnosed her with COVID. Anyway, yeah, so up there you'll see a thing. We've been reading through bad reviews on the App Store. That's how the general public of Australia was working. They were doing tech support on App Store reviews. There was just a support at inbox. No no social media support. Politicians gathering every day. We're in a pandemic, and the Australian public is left doing App Store support reviews. And one of the things we found was, well, you could only register the application if you were on 4G. What? So everyone's trapped at home and they can't register for COVIDSafe because they're on the Wi-Fi? It turned out that there were firewall rules on the back end that blocked connectivity if it was not an Australian IP address. So if anyone does anything with block lists, with IP ranges, you know that they're notoriously bad. So we've got people sitting at home, unable to register the application, the government saying, please download the app to be able to do and resume society. And that wasn't it. It wasn't just like Wi-Fi. What about people from Norfolk Island? Norfolk Island start with a 64 phone number, right? So it mandated that you needed a +61 phone number. So Australia is made up of many different areas. And it's not just Norfolk Island, it's like, what about all the backpackers, all the fruit pickers? The borders are shut. The borders are shut, and people can't register this application. And time's going by, and we're becoming even more vocal on social media and actually contacting the agencies. This is a classic, I can't believe this one. The support contacts to direct people how to fix their problems was only displayed if you could register. Yeah, So people couldn't register the application because they had a non-61 phone number. They're sitting on a Wi-Fi because they're at home and under isolation. And even worse is we're finding all these problems, and security at is an alias of support at. So there's no real way to really engage. Like, we found problems with the actual application, but there's no way to engage with them because, like, we're stuck there with all the people who try to configure that application. It's not properly triaged. No real way to engage with the government. And through studying of the source code, it was determined that the application was in breach of the legislation and also the privacy policy. Like, identifiers that were meant to be private, that are meant to rotate, was constant. So that meant that it was possible to identify who someone was and your proximity to that person. Ouch. Some safety issues there. So, we started emailing ministers. We started emailing media contacts. Got on the phone and called them. It's like, hey, we're going to be doing an interview shortly about our findings. They have awareness of us. And nothing. Absolutely nothing. From ministers to media contact to privacy. Like, we even contacted a law firm that was named on the privacy policy. Absolutely nothing. What is the point of a privacy policy if the people who authored it and implemented it are uncontactable and unaccountable, right? All the players were completely meh. We found an implementation error in the Singapore application. That engineer fixed it same day. We can link to the GitHub commit where they fixed that because we're based off that source code. Nothing. So, this is the part where it gets very interesting. The application was in serious breach of the privacy policy and legislation. People can't register for the application. And the various media contacts, because your journalism, you ask for a right of reply, and I quote, it's like, oh, we're following Agile. We're following Agile. We will fix it. We will fix it. So meanwhile, myself and a bunch of researchers, we were decompiling the application. We actually automated it to actually decompile the application, and we're looking at the source code. And they shipped their first iteration. They're in a complete awareness that this application, like people having issues being diagnosed with COVID and they tapped the wrong location, and they shipped a new coat of paint. The first release of the application was a brand new logo and a brand new look and fresh look. They didn't fix the privacy policy issues, the thing that actually even made it possible to actually exist or in breach of legislation. New coat of paint. They're doing Agile, a capital A. So we took our findings, took it to the ABC, 7:30 a.m. slot, Radio National. We expressed our concerns that critical faults are not being resolved. We've got no way to engage with the government. Our only choice is essentially drag the government through the media. That's not really great. That's not great at all. So this is probably the best summary I can give of the attitude of the Australian government, and it's really unfortunate if you contrast it, say, New Zealand government or other governments. Through appearing on Radio National, I got some backdoor contacts to the federal PMO. And essentially this was the attitude. Because you're speaking with the media first, you can go F off. Like if I had have spoken with them directly and gone to them and before speaking with the media, they probably would have accepted our help. But because we spoke with the media, but we wouldn't have had these contacts unless we spoke to the media, get lost. So a couple of good things came from ABC Radio National was we created this thing called Oz Open Tech. And Oz Open Tech is a collective of engineers. So one of the engineers here in the room today is Jim, hopefully, and Vanessa, Richard, and myself. And basically we started pulling apart the application a lot more. and we started looking at various other aspects. So, like Jim is a Bluetooth engineer, right? And this is an application that's meant to be off Bluetooth. Not a single Bluetooth engineer was consulted about its usage of radios, whatsoever. So Jim started pulling it apart, and we started really just publishing research. So Oz Open Tech is inspired by the Sunflower movement. We're just a bunch of Aussies pushing the status quo and just think that better technology should exist in the public sector. You'll find us over here on GitHub, so github.com/OzOpenTech. And right now we're a little bit dormant, but the point being is if something pops up, for example, each of the different governments started pushing these QR code apps, and they started saying that holograms are security, and a hologram was an animated GIF, right? So we started pulling that apart. So anytime you see the Australian government doing something and you're wondering, this doesn't smell right, come join us. We're probably already picking it apart, or it's very easy to call a rally to come pick it apart. So we published our own report with no way to actually work with the government. We just had to keep working in the media. And that's not great for confidence in the application. So this is our report. I won't have enough time to get into the inner details of all our findings, but I really recommend reading that. It goes all the way into the privacy policy violations, some of the problems with Bluetooth, the engagement model, and also I recommend this series by Royce. Royce looks into the procurement of the application. You can't just look at technology in isolation of its implementation and its flaws. You have to understand where it came from, what were the circumstances. A lot of this was created by contracts subbed out by the Digital Transformation Agency. Now, these contracts are all commercial in confidence. Now, commercial in confidence is a fantastic way to hinder freedom of information requests. So, you probably guess why they quite like this approach. So, I caught up with Jim the other day, and he said the mistakes in Bluetooth for COVIDSafe were obvious and predictable. Obvious and predictable. While pen tests were done on really basic things such as checking SSL certs are pinned, a technology that hinged upon the usage of radio, no one actually really looked whether radio could actually do what it was said to do. Now, the way COVIDSafe works in general is you have a mobile operating system, iPhone or Android, and the application runs in userland. And what happens is the application is divided into two parts, client and server. And the server advertises, hey, I'm COVIDSafe. And then the client goes, hey, are you COVIDSafe? And if there's an agreement, because you trust what the client says, right? The server says, it does a Bluetooth pairing. Yeah. So this was meant to be the application that we were told, download the app and you can go to the footy. Right? And when I say that no real fundamentals from a radio perspective were done, or looking at from a time and space complexity, this is essentially the N handshake problem, right? It's a stateful-based protocol where it's going around and it's doing Bluetooth pairing with all the different devices in the stadium. It's an ON problem, right? The more people you're around, the worse it performs, which is a complete opposite of what we actually needed. What we needed was a stateless broadcast protocol. So the more people you're around, the better it performed. With COVIDSafe as it was, just on a time and space basis, was ON, right? Doesn't make sense. Now, you probably caught something. Remember I said, are you COVIDSafe? You should never trust the client, ever. And you never should the client should never trust the server. So the server should never trust the client, and server should and vice versa. So it works by going, are you COVIDSafe? You see the problem? Yeah. So this is one of the research findings by Jim. It's a 9.8 CVE, and what happens is if someone says that they're COVID safe, the phone, if it's running COVID safe, would silently do a Bluetooth pairing with that device. So anyone could just walk around and say, I am COVID safe, and your phone would pair to it. Now, the thing about how Bluetooth works is Bluetooth has profiles. And there's different type of profiles. Headphones, mice, keyboards, network adapters, you name it, all the capabilities. So once you've done a Bluetooth pairing, you switch the profile. So in the midst of a mass cyber scare about Telerik controls and all the rest, if you remember back then, we had the Australian government advocating everyone to download the app, install the app, and it just allowed anyone to just silently pair with you and then switch the Bluetooth profile. Wild. Now, there was a talk a couple of days ago, they were talking about, I think it was on terminals, and people implement the spec, and they aren't aware of CVEs that reflect that spec. This is something here, this is not just COVID safe. I see there's someone working in the activism space. They want to do a mesh-based SMS type thing. Well, this type of CVE still exists. If you use Bluetooth to randomly pair with random people, you're going to have this CVE. Keep it in mind. Anytime someone says Bluetooth and they're starting using Bluetooth in this manner, you're going to run against this, the same problem the Australian government had. And essentially, one of the things that's really sad is the Australian government focused on kind of like an all or nothing approach. They focused on that the application should be centralised, right? It must be centralised because the health professionals need a centralised system. But that focus on a centralised system lost trust in the community. It spawned media cycles about whether, like, where is the data stored? It's stored in AWS, etc. That entire thing that eroded public confidence could have been avoided with a decentralised system. And by focusing on centralisation, that constrained what they could actually do to be essentially running as a user-led application. Google and Apple came with an alternative approach which was broadcast-based, and other countries deployed this system, and it allowed for the ability for people to actually opt in and communicate with health professionals. But by focusing all on centralised, they lost the trust of the Australian public. And they got nothing. And it was just really just a missed opportunity. Because we started to see the individual state departments. These state departments starting to develop their own individual applications. And they started saying, you need to register for this application, you need to scan the QR code if you want to go to the cafe. And the missed opportunity is, well, I'm travelling around Australia in a van, and let me tell you, I had to install all these apps. And the registration flow for each one of these apps was all completely different. And I'm technically literate. Like, they were on the borders of New South Wales and Victoria, there was grey nomads, like, creating little villages either side, and they're trying to get the apps installed, and they couldn't get it installed. And this could have been a federal system. This could have been, the QR codes could have been in the federal application. New Zealand did this. They had one app that worked everywhere. In Australia, we had each individual state had their own individual implementation, and the implementations weren't protected by strong privacy and legislation. So, for example, Western Australia, the police started using the centralised collection of data to go after criminals, which further eroded trust in the application. This could have been a centralised application. And what we got was an addiction to press conferences, right? Like, we're in Melbourne. This says enough. This says enough, right? Wow. And it wasn't just Melbourne, it was every state. Now, it's now 2023. Entire generations of people have been raised without television. They don't know who Molly Meldrum is. They don't watch the Oscars. They don't know anything. But for some reason, for this particular thing, they need to turn on this TV and then find the coax cable and plug in their TV or find some way to connect. And it's such a missed opportunity because everyone had an app on their phone. The app on their phone could have been like a weather report. It could have shown all the information of relevance and need to allow them to convey the information. Instead, they did press conferences. And from then, it turned into Chinese whispers. People would report upon what was said. They had the power of distribution. It was on everyone's phones. But press conferences, that makes no sense. We just got a bunch of bin chickens on television. And it's just so sad because the underlying problems that affected COVID and COVIDSafe are still here today. I can talk about the technology problems and all the implementations. Launches never go right. But the underlying problems have not been resolved. For one, the Australian government is still not a CNA. Now, the CNA is responsible for the numbering when you raise a CVE. If you have a product and you want to be involved in the process, if someone's raising a security defect, then you should be a CNA. In this case, we raised the CVE, there was a 9.8, and the Australian government tried to actually get it downgraded because it didn't look politically great. So, we're still not a CNA. We should be a CNA. We still don't have a vulnerability disclosure program, right? The ASD, so 1300 Cyber 1, you try calling them, they're like, oh yeah, thanks for your report and goodbye. I don't even know if some of the stuff we were working on, it was strange. That vulnerability, Jim was on LinkedIn sending messages to governments in Morocco and all these other countries that use this application. We've got no security clearances and we're just randomly connecting with different countries. We're in murky waters, right? We've got no security clearances. We don't even know if it's safe what we're doing. We just want to help the general public, and what we found in Australia affected other countries as well. We still don't have a vulnerability disclosure program. Some people focus on the bug bounty, which is the idea of payouts, etc., but bounty is not it. It's actually about a process to engage the government and to coordinate releases. We still don't have that, and that's sad. There still remains no way to build software openly with the government. The example I'd like to give here is the Dutch government. That's why we got windmills. The Dutch government, they were stuffing up as hard as the Australian government. Now, they decided they're going to fix their problems by holding a hackathon with pizza. Innovation theatre. Now, what they got was in that competition they held, they got companies rebadging the Singapore application as if it was their own application. They got so many things that just would not be compliant. It was essentially pizzaware. Now, this is the part that's wild. The intelligence organisation in the Netherlands actually did their own assessment. They leaked it to the press. That's how they managed to change the political landscape in there. They were going in a bad place. As a result of that leak, a wise idea came up, let's build in the open. All the software engineers are just sitting here, time is meaningless, and they all want to help out. So they opened a GitHub repo, and the Minister for Health actually committed a Git commit. The first Git commit, and it was essentially top to bottom of the application being open source and inviting people to come build it with them. They started doing sprints where anyone in Australia, I was here in Australia dialing into a Dutch call and we're just sharing knowledge backwards and forwards. It was lovely. The UX was designed by the engineer of Uber. He was Dutch, right? And all these people started contributing their time pro bono. There's no such thing to be able to do that here in Australia at this stage, and that's really sad. Now, something that was good that came out of the Dutch government was they actually held a symposium at the end of it, and between different governments of different countries with the public sector workers. And they actually shared lessons learned. The UK were there and a few other countries. Noticeably absent was Australia. I was there. So, we need to fix that. Because the status quo that we have now is essentially, if you know something, you say something, you've got to drag the government for the media, and that really doesn't help. So we were pushing very hard for source code to be released. Very hard for source code to get released. And in the end, they did start releasing source code. It was nice. Kinda. This will probably sum up the attitude and skill set that we have here. Essentially what they were doing every release was they were unzipping a tarball on top of the repo and then committing that repo. That was great. And the software license that it was released under was not open source whatsoever. It contained this absolute corker, and this was quite alarming. Buried down in a couple of paragraphs, it says, by viewing this source code, I am responsible for any costs of third-party claims associated with my access to this source code and must pay those claims on request. What? It's right there on the repo. You can go have a look. So meanwhile, this software is being built commercial in competence by all these corporations, and we're a bunch of technologists talking about this application and the problems, right? Well, there's rights of remedy, right? Like, what happens? What legal place are we as researchers? Are we causing damage to them? And by viewing that source code, can they come after us? So we never looked at the source code. We just kept looking at our decompiled source code because that worked for us. Anyway, so now the application is scrapped. It cost us $21 million. And a lot of the things that caused the application to be a failure are still here because we don't have a way to publicly engage with the department. Now, one thing I can ask is check your parents' phone, check your grandparents' phone. They've probably still got the app installed. I come along a lot of people in my travels, and they still have the app installed. So help them get rid of the app. Delete the app. And I suppose one of the underlying things of why I really personally got involved, apart from trying to see what I can do to expedite seeing my kids, etc., because this was meant to be the app that's going to open up the economy, etc. The idea is if you had the app, maybe you could cross the borders sooner. Hell yeah, I'm in. Now, medical professionals deserve tools that work, right? This is a product that is launched without any technology representation. We had absolute numpties turn up and talk about how the app worked without actually looking at how the app worked. We had media continually, they're on the trail, they're speaking with us and they're going, we know it's not working, right? And it started creating this forceful feedback cycle back to medical practitioners saying, hey, is the app working? Can I get a comment? It got really politicized. And it's just really sad because, if they're getting this pressure to actually, you must use the application, essentially what's happening is they're being forced to use a tool that doesn't work. And if you've got only 8 hours a day, and you're being forced to use a tool that we know is ineffective, but they're doing anyway for political reasons, that's robbing them of time that they could be better spent contract tracing through traditional methods. And there were other techniques that could have worked. It's just sad. Anyway, these days I'm building a little hacker pad down in Kangaroo Island. If you're ever down that area in Adelaide, please say hello. Just a nice little place where you can come hack on open source. And a little bit later, I'd like to encourage you to get on the beers. Thank you so much for being here. Please have a look at these two reports. On the left is our independent report that went into all the problems with timelines of how and when and how it all went down. Over right looks at the commercials and how all these agreements between the DTA and the rest of the organisations worked. Thank you.
relative to be heard in this environment, please do put your hand up. You frightened them all. You lot have been carrying this app around in your pocket. You must have questions.
Thanks, Geoff. You said that you kind of, I guess, wish that the government had more of an approach to kind of doing collaborative open source development around things like this, and there should be a model for that. And how do we do that? And I guess fear, having worked in the government previously, that that's not really possible. The government doesn't really know how to do that. It doesn't have trust in communities to kind of do that for them. But we have a huge wealth of talent in the country, and I guess it was perhaps a lost opportunity that people didn't come together to maybe try to build something like this at the start of the pandemic independently, and kind of deliver that solution maybe in tandem or as an exemplar. And I guess I wonder, how do we make sure we engage those communities, or stay in touch with those communities to make that stuff happen? Because ultimately, to build public good, you need a community around it. That's what these conferences and all of this is really about. I just wonder how do we do that? Do you have ideas?
Yeah, sure. So the question is, how do we essentially engage and build in public? So I attended Pia's talk yesterday. That was lovely. She has some ideas. As for engaging community, it was such a missed opportunity. Everyone was just sitting at home, right? The Dutch government understood this eventually. The minister who was responsible for that is now the Dutch Minister of Innovation. He did quite well out of it. What can we do? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I can recommend joining the Oz Open Tech Discord, or if you see something, the government's launching something, just come start a discussion in there, because so far we've pulled apart everything from how voting machines and election work through Vanessa's work, to the contact tracing apps, to myself, I did a little application called jabmaker.com, and it would generate a COVID vaccination certificate, because authenticity in Australia is apparently just a PDF. Yes. But the point being is, we've got a whole bunch of essentially troublemakers there who are technically competent, who will pull apart the application. So it's been good because it's brought together like-minded minds, but throwing crap in the press, it's not the best way to engage. So I hope someone here or someone who watches this talk or what have you, there needs to be change, because there are a lot of people who are technically competent, they know what you're speaking about, they're starting to organise, and the alternative is you get dragged in the media. It's not going to work. The literacy is continually to improve, and people are able to see something's wrong. It was such a wasted opportunity that you look at the Zoomers and all the rest, and they've got no free-to-air TV, and yet they had to tune into free-to-air TV. It was weird. So we need proper digital engagement techniques. And I'm not sure how or what that's needed to be changed, but I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed that immensely. My question is maybe more practical. Did you ever get a response from the government or from the COVIDSafe people through their support team, or did you get any interaction at all?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Through appearing on, so the question was, did we ever get into contacts with the government as a result? Yes. One, connection to the federal PMO office that basically told us to go get effed. And the other one was, we got a contact in the didn't transform anything department. Yeah, there's some story there. I suppose if you're in that department, you're in that government, and credible people who were expert in their domain come up and speak, your one job, if you're in that public sector, is connect your agency with those knowledgeable and credible people and help work towards a good public outcome. So yeah, we got a contact there at a director level, looked at our findings, and then they shipped a new coat of paint. And at which point we were like, nah, stuff this. We're just going to keep publishing our own stuff. Because I encourage you to catch up with Jim, hallway track myself, and I can go into a little bit more. But essentially, it was all falling on deaf ears. It was just disdain. Yeah. They were, for all this, they'd never actually launched a initiative direct to consumer. The agency is essentially, they engage contracts between different departments of the government, or they work with like Enterprise Wisdom. The idea of a brand new mobile phone release is something that they'd never done before. And the fact there was no customer support or all the rest, it just wasn't even thought of. So fundamentally something needs to change in that department. So yeah, we got some contacts, but we very quickly discarded those contacts when they discarded us.
Could I add to that answer?
Yes, please, Jim.
Okay, just I'll bring you a microphone, and then that's going to be about it.
And thank you, Geoff. It was a wonderful talk, and also thank you for all the work you did at the time and subsequently. I actually did get contacted by the DTA much later in the process, and at this point the iPhone app still didn't work. And despite all of what Geoff has just told us, they actually came to us and asked for help because they were unable to make the iPhone app work. And I'm not an iPhone developer, and it wasn't. I was just trying to help convey the technical details and mediate that. But Richard, who was another person.
Yeah.
And what was incredible to me, and probably one of 1,000 different moments that completely blew my mind, was that even in that moment, asking for help, they seemed to be unable to figure out how to engage with us properly. And because we wanted to, we helped. We wanted to make the app work in whatever, build the credit that we needed to have them listen. And in that process, we still couldn't seem to get across the line and get the problem fixed. And it was incredible how difficult they made, even when they were on the back foot, they still made it hard to work with us.
Even when they wanted to, they couldn't.
Yeah, and then sort of subsequently all of the things that involved reporting security issues and things like that, and there was a lot of contacts that came a lot later. This is kind of 9 months into the thing. They still were very selective about what they replied to in emails. They still were very unclear what they wanted us to do and how they wanted us to communicate and stuff like that.
So, Jim, the problem was we're not a commercial entity. We're a collective community, and like a collective community, you can't put that in a statement of work or paper around it. Yeah, so we would have had more success if we were Oz Open Tech as an entity that could have like had some sort of joined a like legal contract of like deliverables, etc. They just didn't know how to engage with a whole bunch of people who are subject matter experts in their own particular way. Like, just no playbook at all.
Just another little detail. That particular issue was that when the app was installed on your phone, it broke the connection to IBD monitors.
Oh.
Repeat what you say.
Yeah, so
we're going to have to wind this up, I'm afraid. Yeah. But it sounds like actually people would, hey, it's your break. You want to keep talking? So someone asked the question over there, how do we do this differently? Well, it's not a technical solution, it's a community solution, and we can.
Yeah.
That's the wonderful thing about this community. That's why we're here.
Yeah.
So on behalf of the people here, there's a little gift from us to you, and thank you. I hope you've managed to spend time with your children since then.
Yep.
Thank you.